From the very beginning, Heath Andrew Ledger was not destined to be ordinary. Born on April 4th, 1979, in Perth, Australia, he grew up in the kind of sun-soaked childhood that seemed far removed from the shadows that would later follow him. His parents, Kim and Sally, raised him in a quiet suburb. Where his boundless energy was both a joy and a challenge. He was different, restless, filled with a hunger that even as a boy seemed larger than life. Those who knew him recalled how his imagination never seemed to switch off. He lived in his own worlds, creating stories, stepping into characters even before he understood what acting truly meant. He was a boy chasing the spark of something greater, though none could have guessed how brightly and how briefly that spark would burn at school. Heath was known not only for his striking looks, but for his ability to throw himself fully into whatever captured his interest. He wasn't the type to follow the rules quietly. He had a defiance about him, a curiosity, as though he could never be satisfied by surface answers. That trait would carry him through life, propelling him forward while simultaneously haunting him. He discovered acting almost by accident, performing in local theater productions. And it didn't take long before people began to notice his raw talent. He wasn't polished. He wasn't trained. But he had a presence. He had that magnetic pull that made people stop and watch. And Heath, young as he was, knew instinctively that he had found something worth chasing. His early career in Australia was modest television roles, soap operas, the kind of jobs young actors take to cut their teeth. Yet there was a restlessness in him, a knowledge that the small screen wasn't enough. He wanted more, even if he couldn't articulate what more really meant. That hunger brought him to the United States, a gamble for a boy barely out of his teens, but one that would set the course for everything that followed. In Hollywood, he was a stranger, one face among thousands, but something about him stood out. The camera loved him. Casting directors spoke of his eyes, those piercing, restless eyes that seemed to hold secrets even he didn't fully understand. It wasn't long before Heath began to land roles that showcased his natural charisma. One of his earliest breakthroughs came with 10 Things I Hate About You, a modern retelling of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew. Cast as Patrick Verona, the rebellious bad boy, Heath exuded a mix of charm, danger, and vulnerability that captured audiences instantly. He wasn't just playing a role. He embodied it. That infamous scene of him singing on the bleachers, with his crook grin and unpolished swagger, became iconic almost overnight. Young women swooned. Critics took notice. Suddenly, Heath Ledger was no longer just another Australian import. He was Hollywood's newest heartthrob. But fame sits strangely on those who are not built for it, and Heath was never entirely comfortable with the label he was being given. The industry wanted to box him in, to sell him as the next romantic lead, the next pretty face. But Heath wasn't interested in easy roles or shallow praise. He rejected projects that promised easy paychecks if they lacked depth. He wanted to be challenged, to push himself into darker, more complicated places. It was a risky move for someone so early in their career, but Heath was never motivated by safety. He was chasing something deeper, something truer, though even he might not have been able to say what that was. That hunger drove him to A Knight's Tale, where he carried a medieval adventure on his shoulders with an energy that made the film unforgettable. It was a strange blend of classic period drama and modern rock sensibility, and Heath's performance held it together. He wasn't just a pretty face in armor. He brought warmth, humor, and grit. The film cemented him as a leading man, capable of carrying major productions. Yet behind the growing success, a shadow had begun to follow. Fame, for Heath, was both a gift and a cage. He gave himself fully to the roles, but each time he left something of himself behind, and in turn, Each role seemed to take something from him. Friends began to notice that Heath was restless, even when he should have been happy. He had money, fame, opportunities, yet he often seemed distant, lost in thought. He was searching for something beyond the applause. He spoke often of wanting authenticity, of fearing the trap of Hollywood shallowness. He hated the way fame followed him into his private life, the way cameras stalked him at airports, the way people treated him as an object rather than a person. And as his career continued, that tension only grew sharper. When he starred in Monsters Ball, opposite Halle Berry, audiences saw a new side of Heath. Gone was the carefree charm of his earlier roles. In its place was raw intensity, vulnerability laced with pain. He had tapped into something darker, and critics took note. It was clear now that Heath Ledger was not content to coast through Hollywood. He was seeking the edges, the places where light and darkness met, where characters became mirrors of human fragility. It was both his gift and his curse. Then came Brokeback Mountain, the role that would change everything. Cast alongside Jake Gyllenhaal, Heath portrayed Ennis Del Mar, a man torn between duty, fear, and forbidden love. It was a role that demanded emotional honesty, one that carried enormous cultural weight. He threw himself into it with everything he had, and the result was devastating. His performance was quiet, restrained, but beneath the surface, it burned with longing, pain, and suppressed emotion. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece. He was nominated for an Academy Award. He became not just a star, but an artist of the highest caliber. But there was a cost. Those who worked with Heath noticed how deeply he immersed himself in his roles, and how difficult it was for him to step back into ordinary life once filming ended. Brokeback Mountain took something from him, leaving him more withdrawn, more contemplative. He was proud of the work, yes, but he carried the weight of Ennis Del Mar long after the cameras stopped rolling. It was as if the character's loneliness had seeped into Heath himself, leaving a shadow that never quite lifted. The industry celebrated him, but Heath began to retreat from the spotlight. He gave fewer interviews, avoided the red carpet circus whenever he could. He found solace in directing music videos, in photography, in anything that allowed him to create without being consumed by Hollywood's machine. Yet the more he tried to escape, the more fame chased him. Paparazzi hounded him. Tabloids speculated endlessly about his relationships, his habits, his moods. He despised it, but there was no way out. Not without walking away from acting entirely, and that too, he could never do. He was addicted to the work, to the transformation, to the chance to lose himself in someone else's skin. And then came The Dark Knight. The role of the Joker was one that many feared to touch. Jack Nicholson had made it legendary years before, and to step into that same space was to invite comparison, even ridicule. But Heath didn't see it that way. To him, the Joker was not just a comic book villain, but a chance to explore chaos itself. He approached the role with the same intensity he brought to everything, researching psychopaths, studying clowns, keeping a journal in which he scrawled disturbing notes, drawings, and phrases to inhabit the Joker's fractured mind. Friends and colleagues later described how deeply he threw himself into the role. He would lock himself in hotel rooms for weeks, experimenting with the Joker's laugh, his voice, his mannerisms. He became the character in ways that unsettled even those who knew him best. The performance he delivered was electric, terrifying, unforgettable. He had transformed into something that felt less like acting and more like possession. But with that transformation came something else, an unease, a darkness that seemed to cling to him. He joked about it in interviews, but behind the smile was exhaustion. He confessed to struggling with insomnia, of lying awake at night, unable to quiet his mind. He spoke of being consumed by the Joker, unable to let go of the chaos he had invited in. Pills helped him sleep, sometimes. But only sometimes. By the time filming wrapped, those closest to him could see the toll it had taken. Heath smiled, laughed, played with his young daughter, Matilda, but there were moments when he seemed far away, lost in a labyrinth of his own making. The Joker had given him the greatest performance of his career, but what it had taken from him, no one yet understood. And as the world waited for the release of The Dark Knight, Heath Ledger was already fighting a battle he could not win. Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker was complete, but the shadows it left behind were not so easily dismissed. When filming wrapped on The Dark Knight, he should have felt relief, pride, maybe even triumph. Yet those closest to him noticed something else, a fatigue that seemed to seep from his bones, a kind of haunted energy that lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. He had pushed himself to the edge of his abilities, and in doing so, something inside him had begun to unravel. Insomnia had long been a companion of Heath's, but now it became something darker, more relentless. Nights stretched into mornings without rest. He spoke to friends of lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with images he couldn't silence. The Joker, with his chaotic laugh and anarchic spirit, seemed to whisper from the corners of his thoughts. It wasn't that Heath had lost himself completely to the role, but that the role had opened doors inside him that refused to close. He experimented with sleeping pills, sometimes combining them, chasing hours of silence that never seemed to come. Some nights, he managed a few hours. Other nights, nothing at all, Dot. It wasn't only the role that weighed on him. Fame, always a double-edged sword, pressed harder than ever. The paparazzi stalked him relentlessly, especially after his relationship with actress Michelle Williams began to falter. The two had shared a deep, passionate love, one that produced a daughter, Matilda, whom Heath adored more than anything. He spoke often of how fatherhood had changed him, how the presence of his little girl brought light to even his darkest days. But love, for Heath, was never simple. His restless spirit, his inability to quiet his mind, made relationships difficult. He and Michelle drifted apart, and though their bond as parents remained, Heath carried the pain of that separation like a wound he couldn't heal. Friends noticed changes. He became more withdrawn, more guarded. When he was with Matilda, he was tender, present, joyful, but when he was alone, he seemed restless, uneasy, lost in thought. He threw himself into projects, searching for distraction. He worked on I'm Not There, a film about Bob Dylan, in which he played a fragment of the legendary musician's many identities. It was the kind of role that fascinated him, complex, layered, demanding. But it also seemed to mirror his own struggles with identity. With the masks he wore both on screen and off, as the months went on, Heath's insomnia grew worse. In interviews, he admitted openly that he couldn't sleep, that his mind raced without pause. He laughed it off, made it sound casual, but beneath the humor was exhaustion. His voice would drop when he spoke about it privately, his eyes heavy, his body weary. He tried everything: pills, natural remedies, long nights of reading, pacing, music, but nothing seemed to silence the storm in his head. It wasn't simply sleeplessness. It was a kind of possession, a sense that his thoughts were too loud, too relentless to ever let him rest. Meanwhile, The Dark Knight loomed. Though filming was complete, the buzz around his performance had already begun. Those who had seen early cuts of the film spoke in whispers of its brilliance, of how Heath had transformed the Joker into something terrifying and unforgettable. The pressure mounted. He smiled in interviews, joked with reporters, but there was always a flicker in his eyes, a weight he carried that couldn't be disguised. In New York, Heath retreated to his apartment in Soho, a quiet refuge where he tried to find peace. He decorated it with books, records, photographs, and things that reminded him of the world outside the Hollywood machine. He cherished the time he spent with Matilda, the moments when fatherhood lifted the darkness and gave him purpose. But when she was gone, when the night stretched on and the pills sat waiting on the table, the shadows returned. He spoke to friends about his fear of dependency, about the way the pills dulled him even as they promised rest. But he kept taking them, chasing the sleep that never truly came. His friends grew worried. Some urged him to slow down, to take a break, to find balance. But Heath was not built for slowing down. He was restless by nature, a man who seemed always to be running towards something or away from something, though he himself may not have known which. He spoke often of his projects, of directing someday, of creating something lasting. He had plans, dreams, visions that spilled out faster than he could chase them. Yet for all his ambition, there was always that shadow, that fatigue that seemed to deepen with each passing month. By late 2007, as award season brought Brokeback Mountain back into conversation and the dark nights stirred anticipation, Heath was caught between two worlds. To the public, he was a rising star, a man on the cusp of greatness. To those close to him, he was a man unraveling, his smile stretched thin, his eyes tired. He carried his daughter's drawings in his wallet, spoke of her with warmth that softened his voice, yet at the same time, he seemed increasingly alone. It was during this period that he confided to friends about the toll his work had taken. He admitted that the Joker had left him drained, that inhabiting that level of chaos had unsettled him more than he expected. He laughed about the notebooks he had kept, the disturbing drawings, the quotes, the fragments of madness he had used to build the character. But there was a nervousness behind the laugh, as though he wasn't entirely sure how much of it was acting, and how much had seeped into himself. When he spoke of sleep, it was always the same refrain. He couldn't find it. "I can't stop thinking," he said in one interview, his voice tinged with both humor and despair. "My mind just never shuts off." He admitted to lying awake at night, reading scripts, playing chess with himself, pacing his apartment, desperate for a silence that never came. Pills became his answer. Not one kind, but many. Prescription drugs for anxiety, for sleep, for focus. He mixed them, not recklessly, but out of desperation. One pill would quiet him for a while. Two might grant a few hours of rest. But nothing worked consistently, and so the cycle deepened. By early January of 2008. Friends described him as exhausted, worn down, haunted. He still laughed, still charmed, still carried his daughter on his shoulders with joy. But the moments in between were heavier. His conversations drifted toward darker subjects, his voice sometimes trailing off as if lost in thought. Yet he never stopped working, never stopped planning. He was filming the Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, a surreal fantasy that demanded creativity and stamina, and even in his fatigue, he poured himself into it. But between shoots, he confessed to friends that he couldn't shake the exhaustion, that he was running on fumes. The world around him saw only the surface, the handsome young actor, the devoted father, the artist at the height of his powers. But those who truly looked could see the cracks forming. They could see the way his hands sometimes trembled, the way his eyes carried a weight beyond his years. They could hear the fatigue in his voice when he spoke of his insomnia. And though they worried, Heath brushed it off. He was fine, he insisted. He just needed a little rest, just a little sleep, just one good night. Tomorrow, maybe. Tomorrow he'll feel better. But tomorrow never came. On January 21st, 2008, Heath spent his day much like any other. He worked, he made calls, he laughed with friends. He seemed tired, yes, but not alarmingly so. He returned to his apartment in Soho, the place he considered a refuge from the chaos of fame. He arranged his pills on a nightstand, as he often did, searching for the right combination that might finally grant him the peace he craved. He spoke to his sister that evening, who warned him not to mix medications. He promised he wouldn't. He sounded calm. He sounded ordinary. There was no reason to believe this night would be any different from the restless ones before. But as the city lights flickered outside his window, As the sounds of New York drifted through the streets, Heath Ledger lay in his bed, searching once again for silence. The pills were there, the exhaustion was there, and the storm inside his mind had never been louder. What happened in those final hours remains one of Hollywood's most haunting mysteries. The morning of January 22nd, 2008, began like any other in the restless streets of New York City. But behind the closed doors of a spacious Soho loft, one of the most gifted actors of his generation was pacing through his final hours. Heath Ledger's home was an eclectic space, warm and unpretentious, decorated with books, records, and reminders of a man who sought depth beyond the glitz of Hollywood. Yet even here, surrounded by the comforts of his chosen life, an invisible storm was circling. Heath had been struggling with sleepless nights, slipping further into a cycle of exhaustion that no herbal tea, meditation, or even prescription could cure. His mind raced endlessly, filled with fragments of characters, ideas for roles, and personal doubts that never seemed to quiet. The Joker, his latest and most demanding character, had left scars no one could see. Friends later recalled how he spoke of being unable to shut off the chaos inside his head, like a record player stuck on the most twisted track. Pills became a temporary shield. But shields, when leaned on too heavily, can shatter. On that morning, Heath's housekeeper, a massage therapist, arrived. The routine seemed ordinary, but the day would soon dissolve into something no one expected. As the minutes passed, text messages went unanswered, phone calls unreturned. The world outside was rushing forward, while inside those loft walls, silence began to stretch into something sinister. When his body was discovered, sprawled on the bed with the sheets tangled, there was no clear sign of struggle, no dramatic evidence of violence. Just a young man, 28 years old, motionless in a room that hours earlier had been filled with life. The authorities were called. The news spread like wildfire, and the world was about to lose its breath. Cameras swarmed the block, flashing lights reflecting against the brick walls. Neighbors pressed to their windows. An ordinary New York street corner was now an epicenter of international mourning and speculation. The coroner's early reports left little clarity. A combination of prescription drugs had been found, painkillers, sleeping aids, anti-anxiety medication, all legal, all meant to ease the mind or the body. But when taken together, they formed a cocktail too strong for the human system to bear. Accident, overdose, or something darker? That question began to consume everyone. The media feasted. Headlines screamed about the cursed role of the Joker, drawing sinister parallels between fiction and reality. Was Heath swallowed by the darkness of the character he had so perfectly embodied? Or had the suffocating pressure of fame, fatherhood, and expectation simply pushed him to lean too hard on pills prescribed to quiet his unrest? Conspiracy theories ignited like wildfire. Some claimed he had been experimenting with dangerous drugs. Others whispered that he had been silenced, a casualty of forces far larger than himself. Close friends painted a different picture. One of a devoted father who doted on his daughter Matilda, a gentle man who laughed easily, a professional who gave everything to his craft. Michelle Williams, the mother of his child, was suddenly thrust into a grief so immense it echoed across the industry. Yet even her silence in the days following his death seemed to fuel suspicion. People demanded answers, demanded reasons, demanded closure that would never come neatly wrapped. The Dark Knight, unreleased at the time of his passing, suddenly became a cultural phenomenon even before audiences had seen it. The whispers of a role that had consumed him, that had blurred the boundaries between performance and reality, were amplified with each leaked image and trailer. When the film finally debuted, his Joker electrified the screen, a chilling performance dripping with menace, unpredictability, and unsettling humanity. Audiences sat transfixed, both in awe and in discomfort. aware they were watching the final completed work of a man who was no longer alive to see it. The Oscar would come later, posthumously, but in that moment it was clear the world had lost someone irreplaceable. Still, behind the applause and accolades, the questions remained. Why was Heath left alone that day? His calls and texts unanswered until it was too late. Why did no one notice the storm building within him? Why did the medications, prescribed by different doctors, intersect so dangerously? In the official reports, the word used was accidental. Yet for many, accident felt too simple, a word to explain the magnitude of the tragedy. Those close to him remembered the nights he confessed to sleeping only 2 hours, his body trembling from exhaustion. They recalled the pile of pill bottles, each meant to solve one piece of his suffering, but together creating a recipe for disaster. The narrative twisted into something more haunting. Had Heath, in searching for peace, unknowingly scripted his own final act? As New York continued on with its relentless rhythm, the loft on Broome Street became a place of whispers, a ghostly reminder of an unfinished life. Fans gathered outside, leaving flowers, candles, and letters. Reporters circled, neighbors whispered, and the world debated whether his death was fate, accident, or something darker lurking beneath. The truth, however, refused to come cleanly. And just as the world thought it knew the story, stranger details began to surface. A masseuse who called celebrity friends before dialing emergency services. Reports of prescription shopping across different cities, and the eerie timing of it all. The boy from Perth, who had chased his dream across oceans, had been silenced before seeing his greatest triumph. The tragedy was real. The pain is undeniable, but the questions were endless. And as the lights dimmed on his final performance, another shadow began to rise. The possibility that Heath Ledger's death was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a darker, unsolved chapter in Hollywood's most haunting legends. The world wanted closure, but what it received instead was a riddle. A young man's life, cut short at the height of his brilliance, a cocktail of prescriptions in his veins, and a mystery that only deepened with time. And yet, the final, most haunting question remained hanging in the air. Did Heath Ledger truly slip away quietly that winter morning? Or was there something or someone who ensured the silence? The answer would not be found here. For this, we must step deeper into the shadows of what followed. To be continued in Part 4. The world was still reeling when the official word was announced. Heath Ledger was gone. He was only 28 years old, a father, a friend, a son, an artist whose best work had only just begun to emerge. The news rippled through every corner of the globe, and in its wake, the shock hardened into disbelief, then grief, and finally into something that would never fade: a haunting curiosity, a need to understand what had really happened. Hollywood moved quickly to sanctify his memory. At the Oscars, his name was spoken in reverence, his face projected larger than life as a montage of lost talent rolled across the screen. Later, when The Dark Knight was finally released, his Joker was unveiled in full, and the performance felt less like acting and more like possession. Every flicker of his eyes, every curl of his lips carried a weight that unsettled audiences. It was as if he had tapped into something dark and unknowable. And now, in death, that darkness seemed prophetic. The film shattered records, his name became legend, and whispers grew louder. Had the role consumed him? The Academy awarded him an Oscar posthumously, a golden statue that his family accepted with trembling hands. The audience rose to their feet in a long ovation, but the applause was hollow. Heath was not there to hear it, to bask in the acknowledgement that he had given the world a masterpiece. Instead, the golden figure stood as a symbol of what was lost, of a career cut short, of a man who would never age, never stumble, never fade, frozen forever in his prime. But beneath the tributes and ceremonies, shadows deepened. The details of his final days refused to settle quietly. Some argued He had been overprescribed by doctors careless with their prescriptions. Others believed there was something far stranger at play, that Heath had fallen victim to the unseen machinery of Hollywood itself, an industry that chews up brilliance and spits it out before it burns too brightly. His friends dismissed such theories, insisting he was not suicidal, that he was full of plans for the future, that he was devoted to his daughter Matilda. Yet the questions would not die. The Joker curse became a myth whispered in articles, interviews, and internet forums. People drew connections between Heath and others who had played roles that demanded too much, who had stared too deeply into the abyss for the sake of performance. It was an eerie narrative, one that suggested the boundaries between art and life are more fragile than we want to believe. And for Heath Ledger, the abyss had stared back. In the years that followed, his Soho apartment became something of a silent landmark, a place where fans left flowers, notes, even playing cards scrawled with lines from his Joker. Michelle Williams, dignified in her grief, raised Matilda away from the public eye, shielding her from the storm of speculation. To her, Heath was not a mystery or a legend. He was a father, a partner, a man she had loved deeply and lost too soon. But to the world, he became an enigma, the rare figure whose death did not diminish him, but magnified the shadows around him. His legacy grew not only in his films, but in the spaces between them, in the questions left unanswered. Would he have gone on to become one of the greatest actors of his generation, rivaling the names etched into cinema's highest ranks? Would he have directed, written, shaped stories of his own? Or had the world already seen the peak, a final act that ended just as it was reaching its climax? What makes Heath Ledger's story so enduring is not only the brilliance of his work, but the mystery of his end. Unlike so many tragedies in Hollywood, there was no clear villain, no clean explanation, no easy way to wrap the story in closure. Instead, there was silence. A silence broken only by the faint echo of his Joker's laugh. A sound that continues to crawl under the skin of audiences. Everywhere. And maybe that is why his death still lingers in the imagination. It was not just a loss. It was a riddle. A reminder that behind the curtain of fame, the human heart is fragile, the human mind is restless, and even the brightest lights can cast the darkest shadows. Heath Ledger was not meant to be forgotten. His story demands to be told again and again, not for the sake of answers, but for the chill it leaves behind, the uneasy awareness that sometimes the line between creation and destruction, between genius and madness, is as thin as a whisper in the night. In the end, Heath Ledger's name became more than just a headline or a film credit. It became a haunting legend, a ghost woven into the fabric of Hollywood. A young man who gave himself entirely to his art, only to have the art outlive him. And as the years pass, his image remains frozen in time, a reminder of brilliance, fragility, and the eternal mystery of why the brightest flames so often burn the shortest. His story is not merely about death, but about the shadows left behind. Shadows that stretch across cinema screens and into the hearts of those who watch, listen, and wonder. Perhaps we will never truly know what happened in those final hours. Perhaps that is the point. Some stories are not meant to be solved. Some stars are meant to remain mysteries forever. And so, Heath Ledger's tale closes not with answers, but with silence. A silence that speaks louder than words, echoing through the dark corridors of Hollywood, whispering a truth as old as tragedy itself, that the line between life and legend is perilously thin. And sometimes, heartbreakingly, it vanishes without warning.